Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Muted.
Good morning from Colombia. My name is Carlos Castellanos, and I am a senior analyst of Cullen International.
Buenos días con todos. My name is Javier Morales, and I work as an analyst at Cullen International in the teams of America and Global Trends. For some of you who are not familiar with Cullen International, let me introduce you the company briefly. Cullen International is an independent provider of regulatory information of different countries with a neutral perspective. We help national authorities, international organizations, and private companies to see the bigger picture behind regulation and competition laws in different countries, in different sectors, including telecommunications, media, and digital economy.
Thank you, Javier, and welcome to this webinar on market power of online platforms. And thanks to the more than 400 people that are connected with us in this webinar. Please bear in mind that this platform, as you can see, allows the attendees to submit questions at any time during the webinar. It also has a function on documents handouts where attendees can find useful documentation and the electronic version of the slides. So Javier, would you talk about a little bit more about Global Trends, our new service, please?
Yes, thanks, Carlos. Last year, we launched a new service called Global Trends that covers the regulation and competition policies of new technologies and services with a global reach. We already published our research on 5G, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, data flows, data privacy, social media, fintech. And today, we will talk about some of our main findings of our last research on market power of online platforms. Regarding the content of our presentation that you can see in the next slide, we will start by talking what are the online platforms that competition authorities around the world are researching, what are the potential issues raised by those online platforms, such as market tipping, killer acquisitions, exclusion of competition, and exploitation of users. Afterwards, we will explain how traditional policy could face certain limitations in this digital age, and how a new approach for competition to the market, namely dynamic competition, could be an alternative to address these challenges. And finally, we will talk about how 11 countries plus the European Union are facing those challenges. One group of countries with a competition policy approach and another group with a regulatory approach. So before starting talking about online platforms, Carlos, would you like to add something else?
Sure, Javier, thank you. So competition policy in the digital economy is increasingly a competition between ecosystems. The most successful online platforms in recent years have been building their business models around large ecosystems of complementary products and services around their core service. And diversification and the integration of a wide range of products and services can deliver efficiency savings, potentially reducing prices. They can also potentially improve the consumer experience overall, as you know, by offering demand-side synergies. And therefore, this can increase the ease with which a range of different services can be accessed. However, and as you already may know, there may also be potential competition concerns regarding digital ecosystems, which renders a lively debate about whether fundamental changes are needed to existing competition policy frameworks. As we will observe in this webinar, countries around the world are proposing a set of institutional changes aimed to accelerate competition enforcement actions or enable different evidentiary standards and remedies from a regulatory perspective. Others are proposing that the fundamental objectives and focus of competition policy be broadened to include the remedies from a regulatory perspective. In this webinar, we will talk about different countries around the world who are dealing with these concerns and how they are addressing them. So, Javier, we should move to explain what are the examples of online platforms so far.
Yes, thanks, Carlos. So let's start by defining online platforms. There are many definitions of online platforms that emphasize different characteristics. One of the main characteristics of online platforms is that they facilitate interactions between interdependent sets of users. Some of them producers, some of them consumers, and some of them people who may play both roles in different times. Now, for our purpose, we are not interested in all platforms that operate in the market, but only in those online platforms that competition authorities around the world are researching. Now, competition authorities around the world are investigate online platforms basically in two ways. One, through sector inquiries into specific digital sectors, and two, through specific cases of anti-competitive behavior of specific companies. Regarding sector inquiries, for example, in the United States, authorities have investigated Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple, the so-called GAFA companies, into 10 specific sectors, including online search, social media, e-commerce, mobile operating systems, mobile app stores, among others. If we move to other regions, Australia is particularly interested in those online platforms with focus on media and digital advertising. Just in 2019, the Competition Authority in Australia released a report inquiry with focus on 3 sectors: online search, social media, and digital content aggregators, with focus on journalism. The so-called news aggregators, such as Google News, Apple News, and Flipboard. If we move to cases, enforcement cases, we find also other authorities around the world investigating particular cases, apart from all cases that are familiar in the United States and in Europe. In other countries, for example, in Singapore, the Competition Authority fined Uber for anti-competitive behavior in the ride-hailing transport market. Turkey, the Competition Authority in Turkey fined Cyviden, that is one of the largest e-commerce platforms in that country, for anti-competitive behavior. However, in this case, the administrative court annulled that decision because, according to the court, the decision didn't meet the standard of proof. China, only 2 months ago, the Competition Authority in China fined Alibaba for not reporting an acquisition that happened 6 years ago. So in conclusion, we observe that there are different online platforms with different functionalities, with different set of users, with different proposals of value. However, competition authorities are particularly interested in certain online platforms. The question here is, what are the characteristics of those online platforms that raise issues on competition? Carlos, can you explain us those characteristics?
Sure, thank you, Javier. And where are the potential issues? And bearing in mind what Javier has explained, we observe that it is the coincidence of several factors at the scale which makes the market power of online platforms unique. This requires analysis of the structure of the market and market power. If we see in the next slide, we can explain that on market structure, some online platforms exhibit certain characteristics, such as low variable cost, high fixed cost, and strong network effects that could result in a high market shares for a small number of firms. In some cases, this leads to competition for the market dynamics, in which a single firm captures the majority of sales. Markets with these combined features are prone to tipping, a cycle leading to a dominant firm with a gatekeeper position and high concentration. It has been said that digital markets are prone to tipping for two main reasons. One, because fixed costs play such an important role in digital markets, these markets feature especially large returns to scale. And two, many digital markets are driven by network effects, as you know, that could strengthen large incumbents and weaken new entrants. When markets are prone to tipping, the competitive process shifts from competition in the market to competition for the market. And after a market has tipped, a potential rival for the market can only overcome the incumbency advantage of established networks through significant innovation. However, even an innovative entrant may not be able to create competition that benefits consumers in the presence of the factors that led to the tipping, leaving open a role for public policy to allow for competition for the market. As we will explain, some countries either adopted or have proposed measures aimed to promote competition by ensuring that markets stay contestable, by early intervention that reduce barriers to entry and expansion. Firms in these concentrated markets may possess market power. That is the ability to unilaterally raise prices or reduce quality beyond the level that will prevail under competition. In our research, as we will show, two were the main abuse of dominant theories of harm, which have been discussed within the debate on market power of online platforms. One, anti-competitive exclusionary conduct, which constitute a particularly harmful event or exercise of market power and an allegedly substantial threat to the digital ecosystems. These conducts are aimed to push competitors out of the market in question and prevent new entry. Here we can identify conducts like refusals to deal, predatory pricing, margin squeeze, exclusive dealing, loyalty discounts, tying and bundling, among others. As we will observe, these types of conducts are receiving increased attention in digital markets, especially from the European Union and quite recently from the United States. Two, exploitative conduct, which are unilateral behaviors that distort competition by directly harming final consumers rather than excluding competitors. In digital markets, the forms of exploitation may arise, for example, by charging of excessive prices to consumers, or worsening the privacy terms and data collection terms offered to consumers, or explicitly limiting the ability of consumers to take their content to other platforms. And finally, questions over competitive effects of acquisition of startups or nascent firms by dominant incumbents have become a key part of the debate. This is one of the most discussed theories of harm nowadays, in which firms acquire nascent competitors only to discontinue the target's innovation projects, thereby blocking the emergence of future competition. In a concentrated market structure, this potential competition from very small entrants may be the most important source of competition faced by the incumbent firm. We found that competition authorities in many jurisdictions are concerned that their merger review triggering thresholds are not broad enough to cover this kind of transactions, particularly when the target firm has a small turnover. So why don't you right now, Javier, explain us about this new approach of competition policy?
Thanks, Carlos. Just to remember the audience that if some of you want to go further in any topics, any that Carlos and I will talk about, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and we will make sure to answer those questions at the end of our presentation. And if the time doesn't allow us to answer all your questions, we will make sure to answer your questions by email. So taking into account what Carlos just explained, what could be done to address those potential issues? Okay, first of all, it is important to remember that before entering to the new approach, it's important for us to know why the traditional approach of competition policy and regulation could have certain limitations in this digital age.
Javier, I think that we cannot hear you. No, we still cannot hear you. I think that no. So I can explain. Meanwhile, we fix the problems with Javier's microphone. That traditionally policymakers have two approaches.
Now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes?
Just go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Yes, I was explaining that nowadays certain online platforms operate in multi-sided markets. Sorry, Carlos, I don't know in what moment
I think that you should start from the beginning so far.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I was telling that before entering to talk about how competition policy could address these issues, it's important for us to know why the traditional policy approach of competition policy and regulation could have certain limitations in this digital age. As you know, competition authorities intervene ex post occasionally, while regulators intervene ex ante in a permanent way. Regarding competition policy, some of online markets operate in multi-sided markets. So loose market boundaries, highly dynamic markets, and bundling of services, among others, make it difficult for a competition authority to define markets. In general, competition policy is very slow. A competition authority could find an incumbent for anti-competitive behavior. The incumbent could be deterrent in the future. However, it doesn't really help the entrants that went bankrupt in between. Competition policy is, in general, backward-looking, with the exception of merger control. It means that there is a legal uncertainty unless the issue has arisen frequently often that a clear doctrine has emerged. If a competition policy approach could have certain limitation, another option, another alternative could be regulation. Today, as Carlos explained before, certain online platforms exhibit natural monopoly characteristics similar to those of network industries that were regulated in the past century. There were three mains how regulation of public utilities were applied. One, to regulation of cost of service and incentives, for example, the price cap regulation in the telecom sector. Two, regulation of allowing access to essential facilities, for example, regulation of the local loop in the telecom sector in the 20th century. And three, breakups of dominant firms, for example, the breakup of AT&T into the Baby Bells in 1984. All these three ways to regulate the public utilities could have certain limitations in this digital age. For example, in the case of regulating cost of service and incentives, we find that firms are not followed by the regulator over the life cycle. It means that the regulator doesn't have the information to calculate the total investment cost of those online platforms, since the regulator didn't oversee those online platforms since the beginning. But most importantly, largest digital platforms are global firms. It means that we will need a supra-regulator to oversee those global firms to calculate the appropriate rate of return and allocate that rate among different jurisdictions. That could be very hard to implement. Regarding the regulation of essential facilities, it could be a challenge to identify a stable facility when digital markets are fast moving, when technology and demand keep morphing constantly. And finally, concerning breakups, a breakup of the large online platform without destroying the benefits of network externalities could be difficult. For example, breaking up a social network into 3 or 4 small networks could not improve consumer welfare. Moreover, dominant firms may strategically intertwine different services, making it difficult for the regulator to separate those services. For example, it could be the case for Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. In general, it is easier to prevent a merger than to undo it. So we see in this part that, in conclusion, competition policy, traditional approach of competition policy and regulation could have certain limitations in this digital age. So if that is the case, what is the alternative? If we move to the next slide, we will see that an alternative for competition policy in the market is competition for the market. As we said before, today certain online platforms exhibit natural monopoly characteristics. It means that in the market operates only one or very few firms. In order for that online platform, that incumbent, to have incentives to innovate, that firm must be threatened for potential entrance in a permanent way. So, in order for competition for the market to work well, to operate, it is important that efficient rivals not only be able to enter, but actually enter when they are able to. However, as Carlos explained before, that is not always the case because of the characteristics of the market or because the anti-competitive behavior of these dominant platforms. Therefore, the main task of the competition authority is to grant the possibility of that entering those potential entrants, potential rivals. So we see what Carlos explained. There are mainly 4 issues raised by these online platforms: market tipping, killer acquisitions, exclusion of competition, and exploitation of users. Each one of them could be addressed with different tools. In the case of market tipping, as it is a problem of the structure of the market, independent of the behavior of the company, the tool to address this issue is regulation. There are many different options, alternatives that competition authorities are discussing. Among them, facilitation of switching and multi-homing. You know, multi-homing is when consumers and customers can use different platforms in parallel. In order to facilitate switching and multi-homing, competition authorities could do mainly two measures. One is by facilitating data portability and interoperability. And the other one is by mandating code of conducts to gatekeepers, to those online platforms with market power, in order for those gatekeepers to allow access to data and to be prohibited to log in users. And regarding this facilitation of data portability and interoperability, that is a very complex task where it is necessary a lot of coordination between different stakeholders that require a lot of process and a process of learning by doing. It is a slow process. That is a measure that has been proposed by Europe last December, relating the problem of killer acquisitions. That is a problem of the structure of the market, but also of anti-competitive behavior. We have that merger control is the tool to address those issues. The different authorities are discussing different options. Among them, change the burden of proof. You know, in the traditional way to approach this issue is that competition authorities must prove that a merger could harm competition. In this case, by changing the burden of proof, mergers must prove that merger doesn't harm competition. Other alternatives are advanced notifications and new transaction value thresholds. You know, in nascent firms, startups don't have high turnovers. So those are options also that currently are applied in certain countries in Europe, like, for example, Germany and Austria. And finally, other measure is conduct ex-post assessments that many countries are doing and proposing, one of them, for example, South Africa. And regarding problems of anti-competitive conduct, like exclusion of competition and exploitation of users, the tool to address those issues are both competition policy, ex-post measures, and regulation, ex-ante measures. The alternatives that competition authorities are discussing regarding ex-ante measures are mandatory code of conduct to special categories of online platforms, those with gatekeeper position. That is an option, for example, that is currently in legislation in Japan. And other alternatives is the prohibition of certain unfair trading practices and prohibition against unfair contract terms. Those are measures, for example, proposed by Australia. So in conclusion, we observe that this new approach consists in using the tools of regulation and merger control for the problem of market keeping and killer acquisitions in order to promote competition that has to do with the structure of the market, and using the tools of competition policy and regulation to face the issues of anti-competitive behavior in order to protect competition. So taking into account those problems, we could move to the next slide to show you that we will start talking about how different countries around the world are facing those issues that we explained before. In order to do that, we classify those countries in two groups. One group with a competition policy approach, and other group with a competition policy approach plus a regulatory approach. So we will move to the first group of a competition policy approach. Carlos, could you explain us these countries, please?
Sure, Javier, thank you. And as you said, now we will focus on the competition policy approach. The latest approach that we found in our report is to maintain the traditional toolkit of competition law and merger control without establishing measures specific to online platforms, other than launching inquiries. This is specifically the case of Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey, as you can see in this slide, which are researching these platforms while maintaining a wait-and-see approach over new rules. A step forward, as you can see, was taken in China, Singapore, and the US, where competition policy remains the main toolkit, although not in its current form. For example, in the Americas, we observed that in August 2020, the Brazilian Competition Authority summarized reports published by other competition authorities and independent bodies worldwide. Several reports analyzed by the National Competition Authority in Brazil include specific recommendations to address competition policy issues in the digital age. The Brazilian National Competition Authority also said that one of the main challenges in competition enforcement in digital markets is determining how to intervene in highly dynamic markets. The authority also recognized a close relationship between privacy and competition policy, which in turn also led to coordination challenges of competition policy with other regulations. During 2020 as well, we also found that in Mexico, the Federal Commission of Economic Competition, COFECE, adopted a strategy aimed to strengthen its capabilities to deal with competition issues in the digital economy. This authority also launched an antitrust sector inquiry on digital advertising and related services. And most recently, the Federal Institute of Telecommunication, the IFT, launched an inquiry into possible barriers to competition or essential inputs in the online search, social networks, and cloud computing markets. Reportedly, this investigation was suspended by the IFT in response to a request made by COFECE, which claimed by itself the jurisdiction over this inquiry. A stronger approach in the region was found in the US, as you already know, where this month, Senator Amy Klobuchar introduced a bill seeking to adopt 3 measures. One, to strengthen prohibitions against killer acquisition, as Javier explained before, where the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys are already investigating some online platforms prior acquisition not notified to the agencies. 2, to prevent harmful dominant firm exclusionary conducts by including a new provision under the Clayton Act to prohibit exclusionary conduct that presents an appreciable risk of harming competition. And 3, to increase the enforcement resources to tackle dominant firms. This bill mirrors some of the recommendations included in the report launched by the US House Judiciary Antitrust Subcommittee last year in October. And in this report, this subcommittee recommended a massive overhaul of US competition law to make it easier to break up giant online platforms, deter them from getting bigger, and prevent business lines from competing in their own marketplace places against rivals. The democratic proposals were divided into 3 groups aimed to address anti-competitive conducts in the digital markets, strengthen merger and antitrust enforcement, and improve the sound enforcement of the antitrust laws through law reforms. It is worth noting that these recommendations proposed more ex post than ex ante measures. And interesting, On 18 February 2021, this week actually, this subcommittee announced a series of hearings on proposals to curb the dominance of online platforms and modernize antitrust law. It is an amazing coincidence that the first hearing aimed to study proposals to address gatekeeper power and lower barriers to entry online will take place immediately after this webinar. So we are very happy about it. The hearings will launch the subcommittee's competition agenda for the new legislative period, following its 16 months bipartisan investigation and report into the state of competition online. Last year, in the US, and also mirroring the report launched by the subcommittee, two important investigations started. One, the Department of Justice accused Google of building an illegal monopoly by adopting a series of exclusionary agreements of collectively lock up the primary channels through which users access search engines. It is worth noting that the European Commission's 2018 Google Android decision was based on similar theories of harm. And two, a group of nearly 40 states and territories sued Google with antitrust claims before a federal court in the US Capitol, alleging that Google engaged in several exclusionary practices in relation to its general search service, including, of course, giving preference to its own services. So, Javier, it seems that the US state legislatures are becoming the fight against the market power of big online platforms in the States so far. We cannot hear you, Javier, again. No.
And now?
Yes, perfect. Now
okay.
We can hear you perfectly.
Please, the other slide that is before this, competition policy approach. The previous slide. Okay, thank you. In effect, Carlos, apart from American countries, other countries that have implemented or proposed to implement this competition policy approach are Turkey, Singapore, and China. In order to compare those three countries out of Americas, we could focus our attention on three main things. One, rules. If there are rules specific to online platforms or rules that are transversal to all sectors in the competition law. Two, enforcement cases. And three, sector inquiries. Regarding rules, well, we could start with Turkey. If you see in the slide, there are no specific rules on online platforms in Turkey. The competition authority in Turkey is not concerned about those issues. On the contrary, as you can see, the competition authority in Turkey is very concerned in both sector inquiries and enforcement cases. In 2020, the competition authority released an inquiry into the e-commerce market. But most importantly, the competition authority has enforced different cases. For example, in 2020, the competition authority fined Google in two opportunities. One fine of $18 million because Google prioritized certain vendors over others in the digital advertising market, and another fine of $25 million because Google put text ads in the top of its list, and it made very difficult to companies in the content service market to compete with organic results. As I said at the beginning, the competition authority also fined Cyviden, that is one of the largest e-commerce platforms in Turkey, for anti-competitive behavior. But as I said, in this case, the court annulled that decision. The highest fine in Turkey was around $55 million and was imposed to Yemek Sepeti in 2016. Yemek Sepeti is a delivery food platform that, in this case, use this most favored nation clause to favor restaurants that were restricted to provide discounts only to Yemek Sepeti. Moving to Singapore, we see that the authority has proposed to include online platforms into the competition law. According to, after an inquiry in the e-commerce sector in 2020, the competition authority concluded that the competition framework is sufficiently robust to address potential issues of online platforms without needing regulation. In fact, the competition authority, using the current framework, prohibited a merger between Uber and Grab in 2018. Grab is also a ride-hailing platform that in Singapore has like 50% market share. Grab accepted the decision and paid a fine of $5 million. Moving to China, China already published new guidelines this month in February, new guidelines specific to online platforms in the competition law. China is an interesting case because before 2008, China didn't have a competition law. It had rules of competition, but it didn't have a comprehensive framework of competition. Moreover, China didn't follow international best practices. It was only in 2008 that China published the anti-monopoly law. However, during 10 years, that law was not really good enforced so well because it was enforced by three authorities. One authority in charge of prices, other authority in charge of decision other than prices, and another authority in charge of merger control. The problems of coordination make it difficult for those authorities to enforce the law. That was the reason why in 2018, a single competition authority was created. It was this single authority that fined Alibaba and Tencent for anti-competitive practices. And Bishop recently for anti-competitive behavior only one day after the guidelines were issued. So in conclusion here, we observe that you can notice here an interesting factor. China has already published guidelines specific to online platforms. However, the highest fine was imposed to Bishop, and the highest fine was $0.5 million. In Turkey, however, Turkey doesn't have rules to specific online platforms, but the highest fine was $55 million. That is an interesting thing to observe. And another interesting thing to observe is that in all these countries in Asia, they have focused on e-commerce platforms. So we will move to the next slide to talk about the regulatory approach. Carlos, could you talk about that approach?
Sure, thank you. So as Javier said, now we are going to focus in the competition policy cross-regulation approach. And here we found that, as you can see, other countries adopted or have proposed to adopt a competition policy cross with regulation approach, under which ex post measures are combined with ex ante measures addressed to certain online platforms. With different levels of aggressiveness, this is the case of Australia, South Africa, South Korea, India, Japan, and the European Union. In the later case, as most of you already know, in 2019, the European Commission published a report on competition policy for the digital era, the so-called Kremer report. In this report, external advisors confirmed their general trust in competition law to tackle the challenges posed by digitalization. However, they suggested methodological improvement for a stricter application of competition rules and called for an ex ante rules on online platforms and access to data. As a result, in December last year, the European Commission presented its proposal for a Digital Markets Act, the DMA, which would address the lack of contestability and unfair practices that lead to inefficient outcomes in the digital sector in terms of higher prices, lower quality, as well as less choice and innovation. The DMA is intended to increase the contestability of core platform services and the broader digital sector, and help businesses overcome the barriers stemming from market failures or from gatekeepers' unfair business practices. Under the proposed DMA, when a designated gatekeeper platform doesn't enjoy a durable position yet, but will enjoy it in the near future, the Commission could impose a specific subset of obligation and prohibitions on it to prevent irreversible tipping of the market. These include data portability and access obligation, as well as prohibition of most favored nation clauses. By adopting this approach, digital platforms designated by the Commission as gatekeepers would be subject to a list of 18 obligations or prohibitions, including bans on using their users' data on self-preferencing their own services, many of which are inspired by past and pending antitrust investigations carried out by the Commission and national competition authorities of the European Union member states. Here, gatekeepers could be fined up to 10% of their total worldwide turnover for infringing their obligations, whereas systematic infringements of the DMA could lead to additional behavioral or, at last resort, structural remedies. The proposed DMA builds on the current European Union platform to business regulation, which set out the baseline transparency and fairness obligations for certain digital platforms, regardless of whether they act as gatekeepers or not. Maybe some of you were asking, why this approach? Well, because the Commission said that these platforms with considerable market power exert substantial control over access to digital markets, and therefore many business users are dependent on them. To sum up, the DMA would take the form of EU regulation, which is directly applicable in European Union member states, and rather complement the existing regulation and competition law. So what about other regions, Javier?
Thanks, Carlos. Well, concerning the other 5 countries, apart from the European Union, it's interesting to observe here that if we separate those countries by continents, we see in the right side, Korea, India, and Japan are prioritizing the online platforms, the e-commerce sector. All these countries are researching by increase those sectors and even adopting legislation in the e-commerce sector. In the case of India, with legislation on foreign e-commerce platforms, where, for example, these largest online foreign e-commerce platforms could only operate in India in marketplaces without selling products. They are not allowed to have equities in companies that sell products in that marketplace. In Japan, it's currently a legislation on large-scale online mall operators and app store operators. It means also in the e-commerce sector. You remember in the previous approach, Korea and China also had focus on the e-commerce sector. If we move to other continents, in Australia, the focus is not in the e-commerce sector, but in the media sector. The competition authority in Australia is adopting or proposing to adopt a regulation in the media advertising with focus with two largest platforms, Facebook and Google, who must negotiate with publishers payments for using their publications in their platforms. And regarding the other continent, in South Africa, we see that South Africa has proposed not only regulate different sectors, but also apply other kind of policies as part of competition policy, like, for example, industrial policies to support startups, local startups against largest online platforms with a level playing field. It's interesting to observe here that when we talk about regulation, we talk about other authorities apart from competition authorities. So there is a mix of topics. It's not about competition law anymore, only competition law, but also other topics, regulation of fintech, regulation of e-commerce, regulation of social media, regulation of cloud computing. But in this particular case, we are not talking about regulation that is horizontal regulation applied, for example, to all OTT platforms, but exclusively to those regulations that are applied for platforms with market power. That is the case of India, Japan, and Australia, as I said previously. So we can move to the conclusions, Carlos.
Yeah, Javier, it seems that it is time for us to sum up. And in the next slide, we will present all this sum up of our report and our observance and what we actually found in our report. Among the countries covering the Americas, we observed, as you can see, that for the past 30 years, the US antitrust law has reflected the view that mistakes in the direction of over-enforcement are more problematic than those in the direction of under-enforcement. However, since last year, this view seems to be changing when the US Antitrust Committee recognized that by setting rules for the underlying structure of the market, structural rules are easier to administer than conduct remedies, which can require close and continuous monitoring. And also, we already explained about Klobuchar's bill, and these two events seems to be changing this view concerning the direction of over-enforcement and under-enforcement in the United States. On the contrary, we found that a low level of aggressiveness in Mexico and Brazil, where no specific competition policy measures to online platforms have been adopted so far, and their national competition authorities have opted for a wait-and-see approach over new rules. Particularly in Mexico, as we explained, where an exposed approach has been adopted by opening sector inquiries into digital markets. And in Europe, as many of you already know, after years of brought several antitrust cases against the main digital platforms, we found a stronger level of aggressiveness in the European Union, which is proposing to adopt ex-post measures combined with ex-ante measures addressed to certain online platforms, named as gatekeepers. The proposed complementary regulation is clearly aimed to promote competition rather than protect competition, therefore ensure that digital markets stay contestable. So Javier, what could you tell us about the other regions covered in our report?
Yes, thank you, Carlos. in the conclusion for other countries apart from the Americas countries and the European Union, we observe that countries with a competition policy approach are Turkey, Singapore, and China with different approaches. Turkey without specific rules to online platforms, but applying highest fines. In the case of Singapore, proposing rules to specific platforms, and China already with legislation with specific online platforms. In the case of the other countries with competition policy plus cross with regulation approach, we found that they are interested in the countries in Asia are interested in regulating the e-commerce sector. Countries in Australia is interested in not regulating the media sector. In South Africa, it is interested in applying other policies rather than competition, for example, industrial policies to support startups. That would be Carlos.
So thank you, Javier, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing us to share our report in this opportunity with all of you. Now we are interested to hear your questions. We are going to answer some of them. If we cannot have the time to answer it right now, we will answer the question by email. So we will start with a couple of questions that we already see here. So Javier, maybe this one is for you. Could you explain what do the measures imposed by Japan consist of?
Yes, I said before, in the case of Japan, it imposes, it applies regulation to marketplaces and online and app stores. However, in the case of marketplaces, those online platforms with revenues higher than $2 billion, and in the case of App Store, they're higher than $3 billion. But it's important to consider here that the competition authority in Japan adopted a very soft regulation, only through measures, for example, of adopting transparency in the contracts, or by publishing annual reports of certain obligations, or by, for example, establishing procedures for certain complaints. The competition authority decided not to go further until now, to wait with soft measures.
I think that we have time for one more question so far.
Yes, can you read that question, Carlos? I cannot.
Yeah, here is another one. Does the cover countries in the Americas sanction exploitative conducts like the European Union? Well, I can answer that one, and the answer is no. After the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court in Verizon and Trinco, it is clear that the Sherman Act sanctions only exclusionary conducts that harm competitors rather than exploitative abuses. These practices are prosecuted in the context of the consumer law framework. And same situation happens in Mexico, where the country's competition law doesn't address exploitative abuses, but only exclusionary practices that foreclose competitors or other firms in the market. On the contrary, as you already know, in the European Union, Article 102 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union potentially covers any practice that exploits a dominant firm's direct customers or final consumers, for example, charging excessively high prices. The list of example practices in this article is not exhaustive, but the Commission and European national competition authorities must apply this article alongside national antitrust rules in cases where trade between European Union member states is affected. We already have some cases, for instance, the Facebook case in Germany, and currently the Commission investigation on Apple's alleged anti-competitive practices in relation to its App Store rules for third-party developers of apps that compete with Apple. So I think that we are basically the end of our webinar is 10 a.m. here in South America. So thank you again. Please bear in mind that we will have a dedicated training on European Union proposals to regulate online platforms, and more specifically on the DMA and the Digital Service Act. Please also be reminded participants of the webinar will receive a discount code, and the training program is available in the handouts and documents tab here in this platform. And once again, thank you for attending this webinar. Feel free to send us any further questions, and for those who ask us questions we didn't have time to reply, we will reply to you by email. And please do not forget to complete the feedback survey at the end of this webinar. That will be very helpful for us to improve ourselves in this event. So thank you very much for your attention. It was a really pleasure for us to be with you sharing our report. Thank you.
Thank you very much.